Andy Warhol, born Andy Warhola, was born in 1928 in Pittsburgh. After graduating from Carnegie Institute of Technology with a degree in pictorial design in 1949, he moved to New York City to become an illustrator. He first became widely known after the exhibition of his famous Campbell's soup cans and Coca-Cola bottles in the early 60s. Around the same time, in 1963, Warhol filmed his first motion picture, Sleep. The 5-hour, 20-minute film consisted of a looped video of a man sleeping. This set the tone for some of his later anti-films, such as Blowjob, which is a 35-minute film, where the main character receives a blowjob from a man off-screen, the various test screenings he did with his actors, and Empire, which is an 8-hour static shot of the Empire State Building at dusk. As his film career rolled along, he began to relinquish many aspects of the filmmaking process to members of the factory. The factory was Warhol's studio. In 1968, Warhol's life changed drastically. He was shot in the factory by one of his former superstars, who was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. This drastically changed Warhol in many ways. Besides obvious changes like having multiple surgeries, being paranoid for the rest of his life, and having to wear a surgical corset for the rest of his life, Warhol's filmography also changed very drastically. The last film that he is credited with directing, the pornographic film Blue Movie, happened 6 months after the shooting. Post-Blue Movie, Warhol began fulfilling more of a producer role and allowing his associate Paul Morrissey to take on the responsibility of filmmaking. Warhol would simply fund the project, promote it, and then stamp his name on it. Later on in '87, Warhol had a heart attack after surgery to remove his gallbladder and died. Warhol's transition from anti-film director to somewhat mainstream movie producer brought one question to my mind. Is Warhol really an avant-garde filmmaker? I mean, sure, he's made some bizarre, countercultural movies, but does he fit the definition of avant-garde? To test this, I will be using the criteria laid out in Naming and Defining Avant-Garde or Experimental Film by Fred Camper. The criteria is as follows. Number 1. The project is made by one or a very small group of people. There's often a minuscule budget, and turning a profit is not expected. 2. The filmmaker wears multiple hats. For instance, a director who also writes the script and edits the film's audio and visuals. 3. An avant-garde film often does not follow a traditional narrative structure, if it even has a narrative at all. 4. The film calls attention to the medium in a unique way, like painting on the film or having film cuts that are abnormal. Abnormal sounds and instruments would fall into this category. A good example of this would be the synthesizer Tony Conrad made for his structuralist film, The Flicker. 5. Has an oppositional relationship to mainstream values and mainstream media. And lastly, 6. Doesn't have a clear message, and there's a lot of ambiguity. In order for a filmmaker to be considered avant-garde, 2/3 of the criteria must be true in the majority of his movies. In the case of Warhol, evaluating his entire cinema career on this criteria would be unfair. He's had many abrupt shifts in both style and scale throughout his career. To get a more accurate picture, I am splitting his film career into 2 parts, pre-shooting and post-shooting. The main reason being his departure from directing and moving to a producer role. So without further ado, here is early Warhol. Warhol relied heavily on workers in the factory. Here's a list of known factory superstars and workers. Hardly a small group of people. In the film Empire, according to Douglas Crimp, 10 reels of film were used to produce the 8-hour-plus film of the Empire State Building. I couldn't find any information on the cost of filming cameras back in the 60s, but one can reasonably assume that the price was not minuscule. Also, he was a nationally known artist, so money was almost certainly not an issue for him. In Andy Warhol, the producer as an author, the author makes the claim that, quote, Warhol inaugurated an art practice that was fundamentally entrepreneurial, deploying filmmaking strategies in wider and wider social context, end quote. So, a profit was expected from the onset of his career. Despite this, many films were never intended to be released or actually screened. Keeping all this in mind, I'm going to say that he failed this criteria. Number 2. Warhol relied heavily on factory workers for many aspects of his art, such as the serigraphed multiples that he did, like with the Coca-Cola bottles and with the Campbell soup cans. In Sleep, for instance, Warhol did shoot the movie, but he recruited Sarah Dalton to edit and Lamonte Young to make a soundtrack. Generally speaking, in the very beginning of his filmmaking career, Warhol did most of the work, but as he got older, he began giving up more and more control. For instance, he hired Paul Morrissey to be his cameraman, and eventually brought him in as a co-director, as he was in the film Chelsea Girls, and he even has a cinematographer for Empire. So, keeping all this in mind, I would say he failed the second criteria. Number 3. Nearly all early Warhol films have absolutely no narrative. Eat, for instance. It's a 45-minute film with a static shot where a man eats a mushroom. He also filmed many screen tests. Screen tests were 30-minute shots of various people standing in front of a camera. According to David James, Warhol was documenting people as they were. The films had very little editing and often felt very voyeuristic. So in this case, I'll give him a pass. 4. He was one of the first to make films that were supposed to elicit boredom. Empire being the most obvious example of this. The Chelsea Girls in particular is a very good example of calling attention to the medium by doing something unique. It was intended to be watched as a split screen, with 2 projectors going at the same time. And whenever they wanted to highlight one story, they would boost the audio of that one, and then turn down the audio of the other projector, and then they would flip it around whenever they wanted to. Because of how unique this is, I'll give it a pass. Number 5. Despite immediately winning the Film Culture Award when he started filming, many critics thought Warhol was playing a joke on them. He did not release a commercially successful movie until Chelsea Girls, and then not again until Blue Movie. Sex in general, but specifically homosexuality, gender, and drug use made frequent appearances in his films. His work was often not screened publicly. If it was screened at all, it might only be at the factory, but the ones that were screened publicly, most people tended to walk out before the end. So, in this case, I'll give him a pass. Number 6. While reflecting on the early part of his film career, Warhol later said that this was, quote, the period where we made movies just to make them, end quote. He was a self-described minimalist, and part of the minimalism was having minimal plot. So in this case, I'll give him a pass. Now, on to post-shooting Warhol. 1. The films directed by Paul Morrissey were more akin to Hollywood movies than an experimental film, both in terms of production and style. There were more actors and more crew. By this time, Mr. Warhol was incredibly wealthy. CelebrityNetWorth.com claims that his estate was worth $220 million by the time he died. As mentioned previously, entrepreneurship and capitalism were with Warhol from the very beginning, so this one's a failure. Number 2. According to David James, Warhol transitioned from filmmaker to film manager after getting shot. He delegated writing, acting, shooting, editing, and even directing to members of the factory. He would supply the money and have some artistic input, but it would almost be a stretch to call post-shooting films Andy Warhol films. So I'll give it a fail. 3. Movies with Paul Morrissey were the closest things to normal Hollywood movies Andy Warhol had his hands on. These movies were often in one way or another satirical of older, more traditional cinema, like the remake of Frankenstein and Dracula. While the films did not follow the most traditional narrative structure, they actually did have narrative this time, so I'll give partial credit. 4. As mentioned previously, the post-shooting movies were the most accessible films Warhol had his name attached to. Music, editing, and other film aspects were almost normal for the time. By his own admission, he was making, quote, feature-length movies that regular theaters would want to show, end quote. So, I'm going to fail him on this one. 5. Many of the films had lots of LGBT character situations and plenty of drugs. Some of the films, like the Frankenstein remake, were given an X rating due to excessive gore and sex. While some of the films were never screened publicly, only at parties at the factory, the ones that were public were significantly more commercially successful than his earlier work. Despite this, many were still not particularly successful, and often had very, very poor critical reviews. So, I'll give him a pass. 6. The post-shooting films did have ambiguous messages, but definitely less so than his early work. Films like Heat and Andy Warhol's Bad actually do have narratives and actually have a theme. The message is hidden, but at least this time there actually is one. So I'll give him partial credit. With a final score of 2 out of 6, late Warhol did not meet the standard of a avant-garde filmmaker. By my own criteria, early Warhol is an avant-garde filmmaker, and late Warhol films do have avant-garde elements, but ultimately fail to live up to the definition of experimental film. Thank you and have a great day.